The Stranded Girl. The space station known as Tiburon 7 had once been a bustling hub of activity, a lifeline to countless outposts in the galaxy, connecting various species with advanced technology and trade. Yet now, it hung in the vast expanse of space like a forgotten relic, decaying and fading from memory. Its corridors were a maze of broken lights, flickering control panels, and the faint hum of failing life support systems. A deathly silence permeated the station, as though the station itself had given up, abandoned by the very ones it had served. In one of the darkest corners of the abandoned station, huddled beneath a long-forgotten piece of shattered metal, was a young alien girl. Her name was Rilla, and she was the last of her kind aboard Tiburon 7. Her skin was a pale blue, almost luminescent under the faint lights that struggled to stay on. Her eyes, large and shimmering with the pale glow of starlight, looked more like a creature of myth than one of flesh and blood. Despite her delicate appearance, she was no stranger to hardship. Her species, the Norns, were known for their resilience, but none of that mattered now. The pirates had come, ruthless and merciless, striking without warning. They had boarded the station, killed or imprisoned anyone they could find, and left nothing but destruction in their wake. But it wasn't the pirates who were the most terrifying to Rilla. It was the cold truth that her own people, her own kind, had abandoned her. When the alarms had sounded, when the station's defenses failed, the Norns, in a cold and calculated decision, fled the station without a second thought. They left behind their allies, their comrades, and most painfully of all, Rilla herself. Rilla had watched from a small maintenance chamber as the escape pods launched one by one, heading into the dark void of space. Her people had left her there, alone, with no explanation, no apology. She couldn't understand why. She had done nothing wrong. But the truth was simple. She was just one small, insignificant being. The Norns were a race driven by survival, by self-preservation, and Rilla, with her fragile form and childlike innocence, had been deemed expendable. Tears welled up in her eyes, not just from the pain of betrayal, but from the crushing weight of isolation. She had no family left, no friends. Only empty, cold walls surrounded her. The air on Tiburon 7 had grown stale, and the food supplies were long gone. The station's systems were failing, and even the faint hum of the emergency power reserves would soon fall silent. She knew this was her fate, slow death in the void of space, forgotten and alone. But then, in the midst of her despair, she heard it. The sound of heavy boots pounding against the metal floors of the station. It was coming closer, the unmistakable rhythm of human footsteps. Her heart skipped a beat, and her breath hitched in her chest. Humans. The stories the Norns told her as a child had always painted humans as brutal, carnivorous creatures, driven by an insatiable hunger for anything smaller and weaker than themselves. She had heard the warnings of their violent nature, the rumors of their ruthless ways. The Norns had always feared the humans, knowing they were a dangerous species that would consume any alien life form they came across. Rilla had always dismissed the warnings as exaggerated myths, but now, as the footsteps drew nearer, she felt the weight of those stories press down upon her. Her eyes darted around the darkened corridor, seeking an escape that didn't exist. The heavy boots echoed louder now, their sound reverberating off the empty walls, drowning out every other noise. Rilla pressed herself deeper into the shadows, her small body trembling with fear. She wished she could make herself invisible, that somehow she could escape the inevitable. As the figure approached, the dim light revealed a man. He was tall, his rugged features etched with experience, his eyes sharp and calculating, a predator scanning for its prey. He wore the attire of a mercenary, dark, battle-worn armor, with a massive pulse rifle slung over his shoulder. His movements were purposeful, confident, and calculated, the kind of movements one might expect from someone used to hunting, used to danger. Rilla's breath caught in her throat. The stories were true. He looked every bit the savage the Norns had warned her about. Her instincts screamed for her to flee, to run deeper into the station, to hide from the human. But she couldn't move. She was paralyzed with fear, her small body too weak, too fragile to take on anything, let alone a dangerous human. The man's footsteps grew louder as he neared, and for a moment, Rilla was certain he could hear her racing heartbeat, feel the warmth of her terrified breath. But then, the man stopped, standing just a few feet away from her hiding spot. Rilla held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest as she prayed to the gods of her people, anyone who would listen, that he would pass by, that he would leave her alone to die in peace. But instead of walking away, the man's gaze shifted, locking onto the trembling girl in the shadows. His eyes were cold, but there was something else there, something Rilla couldn't quite place. He didn't move toward her with the hunger she had imagined. He stood there, watching her, assessing her. She could feel the weight of his stare, as though he was calculating something in his mind. Was he thinking of killing her? Was she about to become just another victim of the carnivorous humans? Rilla closed her eyes, expecting the worst. But then, to her surprise, the man spoke. His voice was rough, gruff, but there was an odd kindness in it, almost a hesitation, as if he weren't entirely sure what he was doing. "Hey, kid," he muttered, his voice thick with exhaustion. "You're still alive." Rilla's eyes opened slowly, cautiously. The words felt like a lifeline, a fleeting moment of humanity in a place where everything had been stripped away. He hadn't come to eat her. He hadn't come to harm her. Instead, he seemed concerned. She didn't trust him. She couldn't. She had been betrayed by her own people. How could she trust a human? Yet something in the way he spoke, the way he lingered, made her pause. She was afraid, but she was also desperate, desperate to survive, desperate for any sign that someone, anyone, cared. The man looked around, his eyes scanning the darkness of the station. "You're not supposed to be here, kid," he muttered, his gaze softening slightly. "But I'm not gonna leave you to die like this. Not today." Rilla blinked, unsure if she had heard him right. Was this human offering her a chance at survival? Was he, against all odds, here to help her? The thought was too much to comprehend. It was a cruel joke, or perhaps a twist of fate. But for the first time since she had been abandoned, Rilla allowed herself to hope. The mercenary's choice. Rilla remained motionless, her wide, terrified eyes locked on the human who had spoken. He didn't seem to be the monster she had been told to fear, yet fear was all she knew. Everything about him was so different from the ruthless tales that her people had spun about humanity. The stories of humans as violent predators who tore through anything smaller or weaker than themselves had taken root in her young mind. But now, standing before her, this man seemed conflicted. The harsh, predatory aura that she had expected didn't fully match the man's demeanor. He lowered his rifle slightly, but Rilla couldn't tell if it was a sign of mercy or just carelessness. His gaze softened as it lingered on her, noticing the terror in her eyes. She could see his sharp features, the slight stubble along his jawline, and the furrow in his brow. He was clearly tired, battle-worn, his eyes hardened from years of war and conflict. Yet there was something different about this mercenary, something that seemed to tug at his conscience. The moment stretched, stretching out in that heavy silence, where the only sounds were the soft hum of the station's failing systems. Her body still quivered under the weight of what she had already survived, yet she couldn't bring herself to look away. She didn't know if she could trust him. How could she? Her own people had abandoned her. The Norns had left without a thought. But this human, he was different, wasn't he? The mercenary's expression shifted again, more contemplative now, as if his thoughts were warring with each other. He exhaled heavily, shaking his head. "You don't belong here, kid. None of you should be." His voice was low, rough, but there was an underlying sorrow in it that Rilla couldn't quite understand. Rilla remained still, her small body curled up in the corner, her eyes never leaving him. He was a human, but he didn't feel like one of the savage, cold-hearted monsters that her species had warned her about. It made no sense. "I don't know what you've been through," the man continued, crouching down slightly. "But if I'd known, I've tried to save you. I swear. This station's a graveyard now, kid. The whole damn place is falling apart, and it's only a matter of time before the pirates come back for round 2. He looked down at her trembling form, his jaw tightening with a mix of frustration and pity. I'm not gonna let you die here. Not like this. Rilla's heart skipped a beat at his words. His tone wasn't the one she expected. He wasn't threatening her. He wasn't planning on killing her or using her for some horrible purpose. Instead, his words were laced with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Empathy. Her mind raced. She couldn't fathom what was happening. Her people had turned their backs on her without hesitation, leaving her to rot in this station. But here was a human, a species she had always been taught to fear, speaking as though he cared about her survival. How could this be? Was it possible that not all humans were the same? Before she could speak, or even react, the sound of a distant roar echoed through the station, sending a wave of terror crashing over Rilla. Her body went rigid. The guttural growl came from deep within the station, and it wasn't the growl of a predator looking for food. It was the growl of something far more dangerous. The human's face darkened instantly, his jaw clenching. Damn it, it's close. He stood up abruptly, scanning the dark corridor behind him, his rifle coming up in one fluid motion. You need to trust me. We don't have much time. Rilla's chest tightened in fear, her throat dry as she struggled to breathe. That roar, it sounded like a beast, a monster. It was like the echo of a nightmare come to life. She had heard rumors of such creatures, monstrous, predatory beings that stalked the depths of space, merciless and unyielding. Her people had warned her about them, but she never believed they actually existed. Yet now, the sound of that creature's growl confirmed it. It was real. It was hunting them. The mercenary, seeing her panic, didn't hesitate. He dropped down beside her, reaching out a hand to gently touch her arm. His fingers were rough but steady, and the warmth of his touch sent a wave of reassurance through Rilla's trembling body. "Hey, kid," he said, his voice steady, though his eyes were sharp with urgency. "We need to go. I'm gonna get you out of here. I won't let that thing get you." Rilla looked up at him, her breath coming in shallow gasps, still uncertain. But his words, his calmness in the face of such imminent danger, pulled her in. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't like the Norns who had abandoned her. He was offering something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. And for the first time, despite the dread that still gripped her heart, she let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone. Without thinking, her small hand reached out, grabbing hold of his. Her skin was cold and clammy, but there was strength in her grip. She was desperate, afraid, but also willing to trust him, just this once. He nodded as if he understood, then slowly, carefully helped her to her feet. The heavy footsteps of the mercenary reverberated through the empty hallway as he pulled her along. Her small legs struggled to keep up with his long strides. But he didn't rush her. Every now and then, he would glance over his shoulder, checking their surroundings. His pulse rifle was always ready in his hands, a weapon of survival in a station that had become nothing but a killing ground. As they moved deeper into the station, Rayla realized something she hadn't noticed before. This human, this mercenary, wasn't just trying to survive. He was trying to save her. And that was more than she ever could have hoped for. The roar grew louder, closer, and with it, the fear that churned in Rilla's stomach. But something had changed inside her. She wasn't alone anymore. And that small glimmer of hope, however fleeting, was enough to keep her moving forward, step by cautious step. "Stay close," the mercenary ordered, his voice firm as he guided her through the dark corridors. "Whatever you do, don't look back. We need to get to the escape pod." Escape. The word felt like a distant dream to Rilla. Was it possible? Could she really get out of here alive? With the sound of the monster's growl growing closer still, Rilla clung to the mercenary's side, her heart racing. They had no time to waste. No more time to wonder if this strange human meant her any good. All that mattered now was surviving the terror that stalked the dark corners of Tiburon 7. And perhaps, just perhaps, with this human's help, she would. The hunt begins. The station seemed to groan in protest as the mercenary and Rilla moved deeper into its decaying heart. The walls flickered with dying lights, casting long, erratic shadows that danced like twisted ghosts along the crumbling corridors. Each step they took echoed in the silence, an ominous reminder of how far gone Tiburon 7 truly was. It was as though the very station was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable, waiting for whatever dark force hunted them to close in and claim its next victim. Rilla's heart raced in her chest, a frantic drumbeat that reverberated through her entire body. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, stalking them through the endless hallways. The roar they had heard earlier was still fresh in her mind, and with each passing moment, the noise seemed to grow closer, more insistent. She had no idea what kind of creature could make such a terrifying sound, but her instincts screamed that it was a predator unlike any she had ever encountered. The stories her people had told her about the dangers of space suddenly felt all too real. The mercenary, whose name Rilla still didn't know, moved with a grace and precision that belied his rough appearance. His eyes were sharp, constantly scanning their surroundings as he led her through the wreckage of the station. His pulse rifle was held tightly in his hands, his grip never wavering. He had clearly been through hell and back, but his focus was unshakable. Rilla couldn't help but wonder what kind of man would risk his life to save someone like her, a small alien child, alone and abandoned by her own people. "Stay close," the mercenary muttered, glancing over his shoulder at Rilla. His voice was a low growl, barely audible over the sounds of their hurried footsteps. "We don't have much time. That thing won't stop until it catches us." Rilla nodded, her breath shallow as she tried to keep up with his long strides. She wasn't used to running. Norin children were taught to conserve energy, to remain hidden, to survive. The thought of running from something so terrifying was foreign to her, but with the mercenary's hand firmly on her arm, urging her onward, she had no choice but to follow. They turned a corner, and Rilla nearly collided with a rusted door that the mercenary pushed open. It creaked on its hinges, the sound echoing far too loudly for her liking. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single flickering light hanging from the ceiling. The air was stale and thick with the scent of rust and decay, but it was a moment of relative safety, at least for the time being. The mercenary closed the door behind them with a soft thud, then turned to face Rilla. His expression was tense, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of danger. He didn't seem to breathe a sigh of relief, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something like determination, or perhaps resolve. He knew that they were not safe. Not yet. "This is just a temporary stop," he said, his voice steady but low. "We can't stay here long. I need to get you to the escape pod, but we have to be careful. That thing, whatever it is, it's hunting us, and it knows how to track us." Rilla's mind raced. She didn't fully understand what the mercenary was saying. What did he mean by tracking? What kind of creature could follow them so relentlessly, even through the labyrinth of the station? But there was no time for questions. The fear in his voice was enough to make her stomach twist. If he was scared, then the monster was far worse than anything she could have imagined. "Do you think we can make it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. She didn't want to sound weak, but the terror that gripped her chest made it hard to breathe. The mercenary didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at the pulse rifle in his hands, checking the charge level. He didn't seem to care about the monster right now. His focus was on something else. He was making sure that he could protect her. Rilla didn't know if that gave her comfort or if it only deepened her fear. He was a mercenary, a soldier who had probably seen more bloodshed than she could ever comprehend, but even he seemed to have his limits. The monster that stalked them wasn't just a simple threat. It was something more, something terrifying. "We have to keep moving," he said finally, his voice tight. "Stay behind me. If that thing catches up, I'll buy you enough time to get to the pod." Rella's heart dropped. The idea of him sacrificing himself for her, a stranger, was unthinkable. Her people had abandoned her without a second thought, but here was a human willing to risk his life for hers. He didn't know her. He didn't know her story. And yet he seemed determined to protect her, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. She felt a pang of guilt, but she knew there was no time for that now. There was only survival.